most of you have experienced the tensions between biblical scholars and patristic scholars. This is a very common thing in the academic world today. When I began writing my introduction to Eastern Christian Studies, I had to focus on what biblical scholars has produced in relation to Eastern Christian Studies. And I stumbled upon many interesting subjects. Ever since David Hjälm published his magnum opus on religion, The Natural History of Religion in 1757, the image of the early church was intimately connected with the idea that Christian faith broke the spell of superstitious practices associated with an attractable, sociable, pagan polytheism. Quote, "So sociable is polytheism," Hjälm says, "that the utmost fierceness and antipathy which it meets within an opposite religion is scarcely able to disgust it and keep it at a distance." Unquote. Hjälm merely confirmed the view that was already prevalent and would last for another century more. That pagan religions, on the other hand, were completely tolerant to various theories, but only if the right practice was observed. Whatever the Romans believed, they were required at least to honor the gods. In contrast to this, Hjälm argued, the uniqueness of Christianity was that Christianity was more or less completely tolerant to various practices, but only if it concurred with the doctrinal content. In the 80s, Peter Garnsey argued convincingly that complete doctrinal tolerance among pagans in antiquity is simply wrong. Even if you find polytheistic syncretism in Greco-Roman paganism, it is relatively rare. The pantheon was not primarily a syncretistic project, but rather a demonstration of the power of the Roman gods, where other deities were subordinated and simply annexed into an hierarchical order of gods, where the Roman deities were superior to any other deity as a symbol of war victories and others. The intention of the pantheon was the maintenance of a social order, where pantheon itself was linked to a web of relationships, including the emperor, the gods, and the various layers in the Roman society. So Hjälm was not right in his description of a pagan religion's antiquity, but far more important for this conference, he was also incorrect in his description of early Christianity. Hjälm presumed that early Christianity contained the truth as a set of doctrines that functioned as a bulwark against syncretism and superstitious practices. Later scholars have been able to give an alternative view of early Christianity that has largely been neglected by many church historians and even neglected by the vast majority in the 20th century. In fact, Hjälm was just advocating the medieval doctrine regarding the Apostolic Church, which was considered as a doctrinally perfect, but continuously threatened to be perverted and therefore in dire need to be protected. The protection of the Apostolic Church gave rise to new questions and a continuous reconstruction of the Apostolic Church with the tools provided in each new temporal era. That was the classical view that came forth with Hjälm and others. This way of understanding early Christianity was prevalent in the major part of the second millennium and was also ground zero for the Dominicans in their attempt of bringing their Cathari back to the Catholic Church in the 13th century and beyond. In the shadow of the mask, the idea of a perverted religion became a dominant theme in Christianity's defense against the rise of a new religion, Islam. Apostolicity in medieval Christianity was the connection with an original perfection, which was lost in its simplicity, but was nevertheless preserved from advanced doctrinal protection by the Orthodox and Catholic Church. We can note that if we move back to the first millennium, we find another interpretation of apostolicity, which rather means confirmed identity with contemporary churches in the present, whom all identified themselves with the Apostolic Church. But that would be different conversation that I will leave here for today, or I take it away. So, Middle Age thinkers was, of course, aware that the early church was diverse, but understood it as the Orthodox and Catholic Church was under siege, but determined to find the surrounding heresies. In the 50s, H.E.W. Turner labeled this as the classical theory. According to this theory, the Church kept Lord's teaching and the apostolic tradition untainted and pure, and more importantly, understood orthodoxy as temporally prior to heresy. Heresy was here defined as a deviation from a prior truth. Heretics were in this case described as people who choose novelty before receiving and preserving what was handed down from previous generations. In principle, one can say that the general attitude until Turner has been to defend the classical theory, but in various ways, but in various different ways. Adolf Harnack developed the idea that the teaching of the Lord contained a simple spirituality which contained the gospel and had to be grasped through a believing heart. But Christian doctrine developed along secular lines, first in the Roman Empire and later in the shadow of the secular regimes of this world. Metaphysical speculations and reflections and dogmatic definitions united itself with secular Hellenistic philosophy. This, Harnack argues, led to a perverse system of dogmas rather than a living belief. Harnack concludes in his famous opus, Lehrbuch der Dogmengeschichte, 1886-1890, in English History of Dogma, quote, "The gospel entered into the world not as a doctrine, but as a joyful message, and as a power of the Spirit of God, originally in the forms of Judaism." Harnack thus tried to understand how Orthodox Catholic Christianity developed from primitive Christianity to the brink of Reformation, which, according to Harnack, saved the joyful message in its original form. Harnack and others like him created a clash between traditional Christians and Reformed Christianity, where they identified the Bible, and especially the New Testament, as the authentic witness in a distorted medieval Christianity. Prior to Turner, there was a paradigm shift that had its breakthrough some decades later, but started in Germany. In 1934, Walter Bauer published a 3-volume publication, Rechtgläubigkeit und Ketzerei in ältesten Christentum, translated in 1971 into Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. Bauer argued that the idea of an original proto-Orthodoxy is a 4th century invention that we have no recollection for before this century. By looking at the various regions of earliest Christianity, Bauer found that, for example, that in Syria, Orthodox was preceded by Marcionism, and it was not until the close of the 3rd or the beginning of the 4th century that Orthodox was to hold its decisive influence in the region. In Egypt, he found a similar development, where the distinction between heresy and Orthodoxy was not apparent until well into the 3rd century. In Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Crete, we find the same pattern, Bauer argues. Both in Syrian territories and in the territories in and around Antioch, for example, the concept Christians was primarily referred to the Gnostics. And prior to Ephraim the Syrian, Orthodox called themselves Paluts, after Paulus of Conon. Instead of understanding later Christianity as a deviation from, as Harnack, Bauer understood the development in early Christianity as a development to Orthodoxy. Bauer basically made his arguments from 2 positions. Firstly, he was convinced that heresy was earlier and more dominant than Orthodoxy in the Mediterranean Christian communities. This is the first step in his breakthrough in modern scholarships concerning the early church. Secondly, the later victorious development of Orthodoxy was orchestrated by Rome, which made Orthodoxy moving eastwards. In sum, Bauer argued that early Christianity became Orthodox. It was not so from the beginning. This way of understanding the development of early Christianity was furthered by Rudolf Bultmann and Helmut Koester and others. Through their work, Bauer's paradigm shift became known decades later, and it was not until 1971, when his book was translated into English, that it became influential among English-speaking scholars. One cannot underestimate the impact this has for modern biblical studies. It has created a breakthrough in modernity for how to understand the early church. Still, Bauer, Bultmann, Koester and others believed in the metaphysics of development, which in many ways related to Hegel. This was challenged by Bart Ehrman in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. Ehrman began questioning the classical metaphysics of history, thereby creating a new rift between traditional Christianity, primarily represented by the Orthodox churches and Roman Catholic Church, and Reformed churches that in some or other way had questioned the metaphysics of history. Through Ehrman, the pivotal work of Hermann Rehe-Marus, Ferdinand Bauer, and finally Walter Bauer resurfaced, and as Ehrman himself states, they, quote, changed forever how we look at the theological controversies prior to the 4th century. In his now groundbreaking epos, Lost Christianities, the battles for scripture and the faiths we never knew, 2003, Hjälm meant that there is no intrinsic connection between early Christianity and proto-orthodoxy in the 4th century. There is no intrinsic evidence that 4th century orthodoxy is an evolution from early Christianity. Instead, Ehrman argues that even development in itself is a construction, and not only the presumed original apostolic belief. Ehrman substantiates this from 4 angles. One, Ehrman argues that the doctrines of Orthodox Christianity must have developed at a time later than historical Jesus and his apostles, later even than our earliest Christian writings. 2, Bauer exaggerated the extent of proto-orthodoxy in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. 3, early Christianity was even less tidy and more diversified than Bauer had estimated. 4, Ehrman also questions the influence of Rome in establishing orthodoxy, and instead locate this to the literary art of combat, which shaped orthodoxy. In sum, Ehrman questions the idea that there is a natural development with an intrinsic seed for proto-orthodoxy. He maintains that there is a development of something, but hardly linear as the metaphysics of history would suppose. And also challenges the direct relationship with this development and 4th century Christianity. Development took place in the changed trajectories that were sometimes sharply in contradiction of each other. Furthermore, maybe the crucial argument was that the very idea of a centralized doctrine was alien to early Christianity. This latter theory seems to make a decisive blow to classical views of the Apostolic Church. Ehrman's theory is further substantiated by a series of scholars. One of the more important contributions was made by Einar Thomassen, who reconfigured Bauer's original thesis when he questions Bauer's view of early Roman orthodoxy and uniformity. Thomassen argued that early Christian diversity also characterized Rome. The number of scholars who has begun to embrace the view of Ehrman are numerous, and now it begins to have a serious impact on biblical studies in this new millennium. This also challenges Eastern Christian studies, and it challenges how to approach the early church. Some scholars within patristics have retreated from even caring about the early church, stating simply that we don't know anything, and therefore we should not speculate about the early church. Biblical scholars are more in a crisis. They retreated from looking at the New Testament texts as witness about the early church, which has been destroyed by Ehrman's work 2003. This has created in some circles a kind of crisis. So, biblical studies is not studies of the early church. It's a result of a construction of a proto-Orthodox in the 4th century, and so forth. A number of conferences has appeared recently, from 2014 to 2019, dealing with what they call the Bauer paradigm shift. There are critiques, but still, Bauer's paradigm shift, approached by Ehrman, still stands in many biblical circles. Looking at it from our perspective then, I will try to make this short now. Looking at this from our perspective then, what is the problem with this? Or is it a problem? Should we just avoid studies of early church? There's something that Bauer has in common with Ehrman. First of all, both of them dismiss the connection between the doctrines in the early church and the doctrines in the 4th century. Ehrman, in one of the replies during a conference in Harvard, said that people almost always find what they're expecting to find if they allow their expectations to guide their search. And I think that he has made that mistake. He's created a kind of misrepresentation of the social history of the early church. If you look at sociology of religion for today, religion doesn't function as political ideologies. They are not born as ideas. It always begins in the structural practice of organizing people. With extreme orientation of the biblical text, which is the context of both Bauer and Ehrman, which has fostered Western biblical scholars, which also has introduced this crisis among biblical studies. It is so focused on texts that the crisis is textual rather than on the early church. It has led scholars on both sides, both patricists and biblical scholars, to reject all possible understanding of the early church. This has been further informed by Hume's paradigm on the doctrinal focus of Christianity, of uniqueness of Christianity, that has also further strengthened this focus on texts. Though the prime question from socio-historical and socio-religious perspectives should not be what did the early church say or believe in, even if Christianity would rise to existence in our temporal. The question would be premature if certain conditions could not be met socio-historically. The more important question would be, where do they believe? For such a simplistic reconsidering of perspectives, to go from what to where, we can begin to understand the early church. We can begin to reconstruct the early church, which is not contained in the biblical scriptures directly. Doctrine is simply not in focus in the early church because it's too mature. Instead, we find a new practice. A practice that is mainly concerned with the Eucharist. The connection between the 4th century Christianity and the early church is the practice of the Eucharist. Instead of the content, the connection between communities in the early church are on the practice. The idea that Christianity was unique, as Hume said, focusing on the right belief primarily, seems to be contradictory looking at the church history from this perspective. In fact, correct practice is very much in center of the early church. But it is, one would say, a new kind of practice. A practice that is concerned not just with what we do, but our internal relations with what we do. Focused, if I quote Ignatios of Antioch, "Now the virginity of Mary was hidden from a prince of this world, as was also her offspring and the death of the Lord, 3 mysteries of renown which were wrought in silence by God." This is a question that could be raised. What is the intention by this? There are 3 things, one thing in common with these 3 events, namely that the virginity of Mary and the offspring and the death of the Lord was voluntary. free. It seems to be the line of thinking from Ignatius, that the acts that Christians are doing are not under the law, they are free. We do it because we love God, not because we have to do it. This is also what the gospel proclaims in the end when Mary of Bethany washes the feet of Christ, and Judas standing at the side of her, questioning the purpose of her act. What good comes from this act? Why couldn't she have given the money to the poor instead? Yes, what is the purpose of her act? What is the purpose of weeping, praying, and extending such a love? The answer is simply that there is no outer purpose greater than loving God and our fellow human being. When every righteous act has been fulfilled, every agreement has been finalized, the act of Mary remains, and everything else fades away. This is a practice, not a doctrine, which runs through the early church and connects the 4th century with the early practice of Christianity. I have to shorten it and cut it here, but thank you.
Thank you.